WP, Lycanthropes only transform when 100% of their planet's moons are full. Callisto III, which has 7 moons with varying cycles, has become a haven for this reason. However, nobody realized that each moon increases the intensity, and the moons are just aligned. An animal lived inside us, that much we all knew. I don't think any of us that immigrated to Callisto II thought much of the place itself. Swathes of barren lands, barely fit for growing food, and water murkier than our pasts, causing an incessant need to rely on your neighbors more than necessary. But we all helped out, because we all knew. We stayed because when any of us looked up at the night sky, 7 moons, blue, yellow, red, dark, bright, or hiding shyly, we could feel the beast inside us struggling to tear themselves out of human skin. But they were kept at bay instead of actually doing so. 7 moons, unable to fill themselves up at the same time, and preventing the human form, or facade, from slipping. And so we lived. We survived. Word spread. And Callisto II went from quaint wet town to bustling Wiracity. Turned sterile lands into buildings, upon which were sowed fertility. We came from everywhere, some shunned, some proud, but all tired. Neighbors were friendly. Of course. It didn't matter whether we lived in squalor or luxury, whether we came here when Callisto II was desolate or vibrant. Because we all knew. What were the odds? Right? What was it with 7? That they all seemed to align eventually? Ask a patron of the casino. Perhaps? Actually no. Ask the owner. Odds are, the owner's seen more 7s than a patron ever will, and it's not many. But all it needs is one night for it to all line up just right. We didn't even need to look up at the night sky. The tingles and burns from the inside. The monster within bursting forth like a heated geyser. 1 full moon was bad. 7 full moons was much, much worse. And we looked at each other with human eyes. For one last time. And we all said sorry without really doing so. That's just how people worked. Right? Wanted to do something human for the final hurrah. Because we all knew there would be nothing left. Our decks drafts. I've lived here for 30 years. I've watched countless ships land with more people, yes. People who felt shunned by society. Not just us werefolk, either. Though the moons make it especially convenient for us. Disabled people of all shapes and sizes are drawn to Callisto II. Because we all have one thing in common. We know how it feels. We know how it feels to be left out. Scorned. Forgotten about. There are strict policies here to ensure that no one ever feels that way again. It's become the ultimate safe place. And it's been that way long enough that people have started families. Kids running around and growing up in the arms of a loving community. Kids being taught acceptance and love instead of fear and hate. Kids not being afraid of us, but coming to my house every Tuesday for baking class knowing full well why I live here. I've been here a long time. And the night sky never ceases to amaze me. The first few weeks I cried every night being able to gaze at a full moon without being terrified. A few months later, another moon. Each of the 7 with a distinct color and shape. I've never self-isolated since moving here. Until tonight. The weather forecast came on this morning and half of the planet collectively trembled. Escape shuttles were frantically planned. But there wasn't enough room for everybody. The same kids at my house yesterday boarded up their windows today. I passed them in the grocery store today and they backed away. Having watched the weather as well. I felt the same shame on my back that I had decades earlier on Earth. I felt the same self-loathing that I grew up being taught to feel. And when I locked the door to my house that evening, I slid on the shackles I hadn't touched in 30 years. A tear slid onto the cold metal that pinched my neck and limbs. And I closed my eyes and prayed for it to be over. I woke up. My arm was sore. I opened my eyes and saw the green sky. That wasn't right. I tried to recall the events of yesterday and remembered clicking my cuffs in place. I was not in my house. Realization dawned on me slowly. Horribly. As I looked to my right and the grass was wet, I hesitated, then slowly crawled to the spot where the grass was glistening. It was red. I began sobbing uncontrollably when I raised a hand to my face and it was sticky with blood. I ran as fast as I could to my house and the door was hanging on one hinge. I looked across the street and the windows that were previously boarded were shattered. I turned on the TV, and when I saw what was being blared out of its tinny speakers from the news channel, the remote fell from my hands, hitting the hardwood floor which had deep claw-like marks in it. Edit. I just wanted to say this is my first post here and I had a lot of fun with it. Feedback is appreciated. As one affected by what I consider to be a curse, I found it to be my duty to follow every scientific advancement that there was about that curse. Supposedly, that curse was sourced from anis in the prism system, and specifically from a plant colloquially called the hearth flower, for the warmth and light it emitted in the sometimes fatally cold nights. An edge case scenario at that. Only ever really happening when one of its petals touch an open wound, which rarely happened for the cauterization it causes in all except those cold of nights. But only in the moment directly after thawing frostbite. Anis possesses 3 moons. Perhaps this is why it went so unnoticed for so long. But before long, there would come a day, looked forward to with greater ardor, that the 3 moons would all at once be full, making for a night that felt more like the waning moments of twilight. And those affected observed and, well, one can guess what happened. Mayhap it was the fact that this planet was the source of the disease. But the change, while startling, wasn't exactly dangerous. Granted, they didn't shift form into snarling, vicious, and larger than normal dogs, but it wasn't a problem that couldn't be solved. Eventually, apparatuses were developed specifically with the purpose of preventing those affected from breaking loose during a triple full moon initiated episode. Of course, when the sightings of the self-same curse began to appear on Earth, it was concluded that it was simply a matter of all moons being full. And, for that reason, Anis turned out to be the perfect place to confine the cursed. Perfect. That is, if it weren't for the days of blistering, often fatal freeze waves. Some several dozen years passed, and I was born. A child who knew not what she was doing. And I had found myself lost in the middle of one of these freeze waves, and surely, I should have died. But perhaps battered and bruised from trying to escape back an ice-covered hill. I slipped and fell as the ice shattered around me and I never felt the cuts open upon my nearly frozen body. And as I fell, my energy left me, and I couldn't keep my eyes open any longer, and then I woke up the following morning. My wounds had scabbed over, and I remembered the memory of feeling something warm next to me. I stumbled away from the place that should have been my grave and, eventually, I was found. I learned of my condition only some dozen years later. When the moons found themselves each and all in full, I learned all that I could about my curse. Research performed with cursed cells on other multi-lunar planets revealed that there was no significant change dependent on the number of moons, research that proved deceptively difficult to conduct. Anis was the safest haven from the condemning eyes of the unaffected, and from themselves. While the conditions on Anis were often inhospitable, when the weather remained mild in its demeanor, it was almost just like the more northern or southern regions on the homeworks, brisk but not unlivable. Anis was the safest home away from home for all afflicted, including myself. Until, that is, Callisto III, eventually named as Lucas. 7 moons. Whose moons were all full once every dozen decades. The next case was to be in a dozen more years at that time, but I was long departed to be one of that planet's settlers. All I would need to endure was one final fell transformation. And then I would essentially be free. Of course. If research had been conducted on Lucas, perhaps we would have known what I do now. The planet was gorgeous, with seasons shifting every few weeks, but the plant life having adapted to suit. The waves were a challenge for surfers, who found that they were never quite constant in their sizes. The orbit itself wasn't perfectly elliptical, going so far as to have the planet quite literally wiggle slight with the turn of the heavens as the gravity wells turned about each other. To think that such a planet would hold so many phenomenons. When the week came, we were shuffled off of the planet so that research could be conducted. What was the effect on a person exposed to multiple moons? Of course, I already knew the extent of my curse, the extent of the curse on Earth, and the extent of cursed cells on other multi-mooned planets, which I should have remembered to be inconclusive. But being as taken with the sciences as I was, I knew to be careful. Perhaps there was another planet on Lucas that we didn't know about, one that affected everyone. Would it that those who volunteered to be test subjects didn't have families that refused to listen to the instructions to retreat? If only for a few days. To the stars. After all, this was a rare chance to learn what would happen to one of the afflicted under the summer-like light of the 7 full moons. It was going to be the last time in a dozen decades, so please, let the few minutes of the full moons pass by and remain in safety just in case. We refuse. Our child is subjecting themselves to this, and we would be remiss were we not to support them. Very well. But you must sign this waiver, for we cannot guarantee your safety. Oh please. We have lived with our child for so long. We know how to keep their curse form from running rampant. How many families had made that confident claim? How many people had stayed on that planet in secret? How many hid in their basements with their restraints, confident that the metal of their restraints wouldn't tear? But when all was said and done, at the very least, we knew there wouldn't be anything left to bury beyond the mangled remains of those returning from a last, unspeakable rendition of their transformation. Those unlucky few who lived would never be the same. As for me, at long last, I was free from my curse. And, in my freedom and joy, I didn't mind needing to live on a planet with a devastated environment. It would return to normal in just a dozen or so years, but that death sentencing moonlight would take nearly a dozen decades more, and I will be long gone by that time. For the first time in a long time, I was afraid. As lycanthropes, our animalistic power often got the better of us, whether we liked it or not. When the majority of our kind lived on Earth, we were known as a nuisance. People often were hurt on those nights, but no one was ever killed. We always had some semblance of control after all. Still, no one really liked us. We could tell they wanted to get rid of us as soon as possible. It wasn't until some scientists discovered the inner workings of our biology that a solution became apparent. All of the moons of a planet had to be full for a transformation to occur. The solution? Find a new planet. And so we did. Callisto II was supposed to be our safe haven. What are the chances that 7 very different moons all became full at once? Unlikely. But not impossible. I lay in my bed that night, one of the 7 moons shining in through my open window. A light breeze whirled through the room, causing a chill to shoot through my body. I pulled the wool blanket up to my nose, but nothing seemed to stave off the blasted cold. How I wished at that moment that I could take on my animal form. Be careful what you wish for, a low voice echoed in my head. Not a moment later, an agonizing pain shot through my entire body from my head to my toes. My hands grabbed my head as a burning pain slowly crescendoed inside. It consumed any other thoughts that dared to appear. When I felt pinpricks start to scatter across my skin, I knew what was happening. The transformation never felt right, but this felt utterly terrible. My mind scrambled to regain control of my body. The smell of blood tainted the air as my fingernails dug into my palms and my top teeth clamped against my bottom lip. Given to it. The damned voice boomed in my mind. No. I managed to strangle out through the pain. Everything in me knew this was wrong. But that didn't stop it. Grey fur spread like a wildfire across my skin. My body cracked and groaned as it rearranged itself and grew bigger. Dagger-like claws sprouted from my fingertips while my teeth sharpened into deadly points. By the time the agony subsided, I was gone. I watched like a spectator as my body rose to its feet. Glowing red eyes surveyed the room before landing on the open window. Outside, howls mixed with terrified screams filled the air. A sadistic smirk spread across my face. I could only watch helplessly as my body leapt through the window to the town below. My own screams joined the chorus of the helpless victims. No one was safe.